Okay. So now I'd like questions. And I would ask people if they can get to the microphones, or if they can't, if some of our research assistants could help make sure people have microphones. Please. Someone's got to break the ice. Yes, please. Chris.
So, what are the various challenges you have with subnational indicators, or because some, like you pointed out in the Panama example, I think was a great example, where it's a national average, but Panama's a small place, but yet there's still, it's kind of a bimodal distribution or whatever. Take a much larger country like Russia. Take a much larger country like Russia, and it's probably a much stranger or non-obvious distribution, certainly to non-Russians. So what are your ideas around that? What are the challenges, and maybe what are your future plans around those challenges?
Well, our methodology behind the failed states index is the CAST methodology, the CAST framework, conflict assessment system tool. And we use CAST at various levels of analysis. So we do national level analysis for the failed states index, which is admittedly quite broad brushed. Often a broad brush is very useful. For other types of more in-depth analysis, we use CAST at the subnational level for specific country analysis that we do for various projects. In terms of what plans we may have to develop that further, the beauty of content analysis is that you can parameterize your queries at pretty much any level of analysis. You can drill down to the district level or to the city level even, as well as changing the periodicity. So we look at annual, the failed states index, but you can drill it down to the monthly or even the weekly. So content analysis is a methodology that lends itself to subnational analysis if what you're looking at is the very dynamic event-driven factors. Now, if you are looking at the more static factors that are like the demographic factors, economic development factors, those sorts of things that are typically collected at the national level alone, and it's much more difficult to get the subnational level analysis of those factors. That is more difficult. So depending on the project, you tailor the methodology to optimize both, the framework in terms of what variables are most measurable and what variables are most relevant for the particular project that you're working on.
Okay, I see a microphone being taken to someone. Don't wait for that to arrive. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to address both Mike and Joseph combining technology with a big bird in the sky and related to monitoring and evaluation. Can your technology really zero? Well, one of the problems we have in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and development in remote areas is access and security, and that affects our ability to do M&E work. Is it cost effective to use your kind of technology to zero in on something and spike, or are there drones that are being thought about for doing this kind of thing?
I can start off with the drones. I might say the other thing we're also looking at is satellite imagery with various applications for the Earth. I think that in the case of the drones, there are a couple things that are prohibited at this point. One is the cost, because drones have been put together primarily for military use. The military has lots of money. So if you take a Raven, for instance, which is a drone about that big, it's electric, it's carried in a backpack, it costs about $70,000. If you go online looking for a drone about the same size, it's civilian, it's got autopilot. You can send it to the GPS coordinate. It'll take off and land itself. It's got high resolution gimbal cameras and so forth. Great. One problem is when we stay up for half an hour, and its range is basically your electronic horizon. So they can't go very far and they can't stay up very long. Now, the good news is all that's changing because they recognize they're in an enormous use, civilian uses for using drones. I mean, think about using drones, in our line of work, Tom, and using it for elections, for counting how many people are going to the polls and where they're coming from. I mean, there are really myriad uses for it. I know that the electricity industry is interested in using drones to check transmission lines, which is what they currently use helicopters and crews on. But there are clearly limitations at this point. I think some of the other things that we're looking at, besides drones, may be cheaper and they may be of more use to us right now. But drones are coming. I believe that.
With satellite imagery, it tends. Is it
I
on?
need it more. It's not
Okay.
very sensitive.
Not very sensitive. Okay, there we go. Satellite imagery can be cost effective, but it is not a sole source solution. It's a combination of sources. Drones have the ability to be very responsive, very focused, have a better resolution at the commercial level than do satellites. However, satellites have the ability to collect repeatedly without interference from local conflict, local factors, except for the weather. We have the ability to cover broad areas with one image. We're limited, however, in the time we're over the specific point on the Earth. I can take an image as I crest the horizon, and I can keep taking images as long as there's no cloud cover and no competition for time on the satellite until I go down the other horizon. However, the fact is that it's still limited because I'm coming over relatively fast. Typically, our satellites would be over a target late morning. So if activity is taking place late afternoon, it would be difficult to identify. We also have the advantage, and so do some of the drones we're talking about, to use multiple bands of light, 8 bands, allows you to manipulate the bands, and you can see certain things that just aren't normally visible in natural colored imagery.
Hi, my name is Jessica Vogel. I'm with the International Stability Operations Association. We've seen an increased focus in recent years on data collection, data analysis, and in the development community, humanitarian aid community, stabilization communities. Could any of the panelists speak to gaps or challenges between the collection and analysis of the data and the innovative technologies that are spurting all over the place, and the implementation of programs using that data?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I was just having this discussion with somebody yesterday, as a matter of fact. Part of the problem that we've got is it's not collecting the data, it's the value of the data. In the case of stabilization, one of the, and this was relative to a project that we're working on right now, but a senior official at AID was saying, look, the problem that I have is that my superior doesn't really understand the metrics of stabilization. I mean, when I was teaching at the MRXs out at Fort Irwin, one of the hardest things to do was to convince a young lieutenant or a captain or even a colonel that what you consider an instinct, that well or that school or whatever it is that you built, is not the instinct, not in stabilization. It's a vehicle to creating stability, and stability is measured in such things as they seem very abstract at times, but they're the way that a community comes together, the degree that it's able to take care of itself. Those things are very, very difficult to measure, and I think that what we in the industry have to do is a much better job of identifying metrics that people can understand and collect the right data. Because I can tell you one thing, in Afghanistan, you can say that we've we've got a gazillion, girls who are going to school, or we've built X number of wells and X number of schools and the rest of it. But if nobody can go to school because they're too damned afraid to go to school, or the population is moving out to other places, then those metrics aren't going to mean very much to you. So we need to do a better job of developing metrics that people understand and that are truly applicable.
One of the biggest challenges we face is getting the customer to look beyond a very narrow area. Most customers become enamored with imagery and want to look in and count that individual tent in that refugee camp. However, getting them to look beyond that, to the other side of the hill, to see what is coming towards them or moving away from them, that is the difficult challenge, because they're very narrowly focused. The other challenge we face is the great quantity of data we collect. Going through it for the more important pieces of information, for the story behind it, can become a daunting task at times.
It is interesting the various biases that people bring to analysis. You've got folks who really love technology and are very, very good at technology, and some of those folks don't necessarily have a really strong grasp on the social science. And then you have the social scientists who are very enamored of theory and don't have a strong grasp of the potential that technology brings. And then you have the experts who really understand a particular context very, very well and know all the players and know what motivates them and everything, but they don't have much use for the theory or for the technology. And so being able to bring all those folks, all those perspectives together in a way that is useful for everyone, it presents, I think, a challenge. So depending on who the customer is or who the user is, you need to speak to their particular biases and expectations with your product.
Joshua?
I'm Joshua Sinai with Infinity Technology. It's a very good and informative list, but I have a problem with one of the countries that you list. You list this, number 61 is Israel/West Bank. But parts of the West Bank are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority also has technically control over Gaza, although Hamas controls it, and there's tension between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. But for policy relevance, shouldn't you have, even though the Palestinian Authority is a state in the making, it's still a member of the UN, and they do have ambassadors overseas. So shouldn't you list the Palestinian Authority as a state in the making, attach an asterisk next to the name, explain that it's a state in the making this way? By not listing it, you're in effect saying it should be ignored.
We get a similar question quite often. I'm going to ask my colleague Nate to address this.
Yeah, hopefully I can address this adequately. As Lao Tzu wrote thousands of years ago, ground matters, context matters, and every country we recognize has very different contexts. And some countries have maybe more unique dynamics than others. So what we try to do with this index is we try to evaluate the pressures on the state and the capacities of the state to manage those pressures. But we understand that the particular context is going to be slightly different in each case. With respect to Israel and the West Bank, our typology, if that's the right word, for the unit of analysis is that if the state is, it has to be a UN member state to be evaluated in this particular index. And if a state is occupying another territory, then it's responsible for that other territory if that territory is not currently a UN member state. So in terms of how the index comes out in terms of the scores, we expect that the users will then look deeper into the indicator scores and weight them according to the weightings that they deem to be most relevant for their own uses. We weight all the indicators equally. And so we just try to highlight where the pressures are on stability, and we hope that that the users will take that information and make whatever inferences and applications of that information that they can.
Wherever the mic gets to first. Yes,
I'm Tom Getman, the longtime NGO executive. The general was talking about facts, the difference between facts and wisdom. And the previous questioner, I think, leads us into a deeper philosophical discussion. And Nate and I have had some conversation about this already. But in 1999, a defense official came and had dinner at my house in Jerusalem and explained that the drone technology was going to save a lot of civilian lives. And then I was in Gaza a couple of days later and saw a drone go over, and then an M14, and an apartment building hit, and a lot of civilians died. And it wasn't just in Gaza, but it's happened in Pakistan as recently as 2 weeks ago. And I'm wondering, how do we use all this technology now to lead us to wise decisions, whether military decisions or technical decisions about, droughts and that sort of thing? Because it seems to me that the facts are overtaking the wisdom, and we're not really getting to the heart of the issue that the general was calling us to. Can you speak to how we're handling the ethics of all this?
With respect to the fail-safes index, we have we come at it with a certain bias, a certain framework, implicit in the index. Implicitly, what we're saying is that social factors matter, demographic factors matter, security factors matter, political factors matter. A lot of times, the analyst another analyst or another methodology might not look at some of those factors. We implicitly assume that those factors are all very important. So we have a very sort of human security bias, or a human security assumption implicit in the index. So in terms of facts, yes, it's true that this is facts, but it's facts that are nested in a framework that has normative assumptions built into it. So absolutely, I would agree with you that we do need to be thinking about wisdom, but I might take issue with the idea that facts are on this side and are completely neutral, which lead to wisdom. I think that the organization of facts themselves has to come with a certain normative assumption, or it always does. So wisdom has to come on the front end and on the back end of the analysis.
To be practical, Nate, who makes the decision about using the facts to apply the technology? Because it seems to me that's where the gap is, and it's going to get us into trouble, particularly in the failing states, where the margin is difficult to analyze, from Montana, where somebody's sitting in front of a computer, or Tel Aviv for that matter.
I think you've actually identified a pretty significant problem. I think it has two parts. One, probably the less significant, but it is a tactical problem for us, is that if you start using drones to do civilian work, which is essentially to do developmental or stabilization or humanitarian, drones have such a bad image that you're going to run into problems in using them. That's one, even if you're using them strictly for good. The other question is, what do you do with the information that you get? Because if I go in to do a conflict analysis in the community and I've got the technology to know that the Taliban is sitting on the hill over here and I can hear what they're actually saying to each other, but I also know their GPS coordinates. So then you get into that interagency sort of thing, is that I'm being asked by the military, well, if you have this information, we want it. And then you get into very practical and very ethical questions about whether you want to share that with them or not.
Right.
And all of these things still have to be sorted out. And sometimes it comes down to personnel. Simply, I mean, you have the individual who's asked for the information, simply says, no, I'm not going to give it to you.
Thank you.
We're very thrilled to still have General Hayden here with us. So not to put you on the spot, sir, but if you would like to answer this question as well, I'd love you all to keep moving.
Me too.
I talk about drones in the abstract. Yeah? What they do give you is persistent stare. They give you the ability to have an almost God's eye view of a battle space. And your model is perhaps a little dated, where the drone in, I assume, Gaza was doing the prep of the battle space for the fast mover for the F-14. The advantage of drone technology with the God's eye stare and almost limitless persistence is that it gives a battle manager the ability to be very, very patient and to not be forced to rush a decision in terms of what satisfies the laws of armed conflict requirement for proportionality and distinction prior to making a decision. So in that sense, it is an incredibly powerful and precise tool. Now, others have made the argument that it's just all too easy, and that it allows a nation or commander-in-chief to go to war without risk, and therefore makes the decision perhaps easier than it would otherwise should be. I was struck, for example, during the conflict in Libya, where we as a government, executive branch primarily, but the decision stood, decided we were not at war, that it did not trigger the armed conflict provisions of the War Powers Act, because we're just using drones and other support aircraft. So there is a dilemma. It is something that really does, as already pointed out, need to be addressed. These are unanswered questions. Can I offer one other view too, because the conversation here was going in a slightly different direction. I said I'm the fact guy and talking to the vision guy and so on. I'm not the only. The fact delegation is not the only legitimate input into the decision maker's calculus. Vision does count. Belief does count. Desired end state does count. And so I actually introduced it very much at the end about left and right-hand boundaries.
Yeah.
But very frequently, there is an awful lot of space between the left and the right-hand boundary that the fact guy creates, and the decision maker can work in that space. It is incredibly rare where I ever talk to a decision maker, from a squadron commander to a president, where I was just giving him such a tightly woven syllogism that he did not have significant room to maneuver in order to make a decision. So facts are important, and they do create left and right-hand boundaries, but it's really rarely syllogistic.
Doug brought to mind the way, I guess for Spike is, are drones more effective than roam plows in stability operations? But more to the broader board panel here. If you took out all the stability operations that are going on in all the different countries in the index, and you start taking a look over the past years that they've been in operation, can you actually do an analysis to determine which ones are more effective and then start to look at exactly why one stability operation, say East Timor, is more effective than Congo? Can you guys come up with some sort of analysis just on those countries?
Thanks for your question, Doug. I think that it is definitely possible to do that sort of identification, to see what impact UN peacekeeping operations have had. Several years ago, I actually remember placing the failed states index rankings on a map of where peacekeeping operations are currently operating or have been, and unfortunately my memory is not good enough to remember exactly what the conclusion was. But I think what you can see from some of the operations that are generally deemed to have been somewhat successful, or at least not unsuccessful, and kind of winding down, you can see that the countries that have hosted those missions are actually slowly climbing up the index. Now, if you look at a country like Sierra Leone, for example, and you look at its ranking on the index, you could probably be led to think that it's not doing particularly well, because it's, as far as I can remember, it's around about the 30 mark. But I think that this actually brings up another really important concept, and I know Nate very eloquently calls it the Humpty Dumpty principle, where when a country falls off the wall and shatters, it does so very quickly, but for it to be put back together again is a very long and laborious process. And so you do actually see countries like Sierra Leone that have had a UN peacekeeping mission slowly climbing back on the index. Now, again, if you look at it today and you look at where Sierra Leone is, you're probably not going to think that it's been successful or that the mission has had a positive effect. But if you look at the trend, and if you look at how it is slowly moving to the better end of the index, then you can actually draw the conclusions that if not the peacekeeping operation has made the improvements, it certainly hasn't made any worse.
Sorry.
Doug, thanks for the segue. We'll get me into a point. I think that without getting into the data that you're keeping, I think one of the things that is that you mentioned Rome plows, and I happen to know something about those 40 years ago. But the Rome plows are very expensive. Keeping an operation, even back in 1970, 71, out in the field was about $1.5 million a day. I look at the operations that we have in Afghanistan, for instance, what we did in Iraq. Enormously expensive. Counterinsurgency is expensive and it takes a long time. I was doing a panel similar to this at the Army War College, looking at national security strategies in May. And one of the examples that I've used is that I think that what we're going to see in the future, given the experience that we've had out of Afghanistan and Iraq, is that smaller is going to be better, that we're going to have to do things with a smaller footprint. We're going to have to do it in a way that is much more sustainable as a business model. And I use the example of El Salvador, that back in the 1980s, that this was not a popular intervention, particularly not with the Congress. And the deal that Ronald Reagan had to cut with Congress was one that he would only have 55 military advisors in El Salvador at any one time, 55 advisors. They could not go out in the field with the troops. They could train. They could carry weapons, but they couldn't use them, basically. And it created what the military thought at the time was a tremendous challenge. We had exactly the same thing on the civilian side by an agreement with Congress, an informal one. We were limited to 136 foreign service officers, not 136, 36 foreign service officers for USAID, and the embassy was even smaller than that. Now, compare that to the numbers that you have in Afghanistan. Because we had such small numbers, we really had to act like special forces. We had, and many of the military advisors, most of them were special forces. But we had to enable the Salvadorans to change their own country, and it takes time. It took 12 years. It cost $4 billion, 20 American lives, and was probably the biggest counterinsurgency success story of the last century. It worked. And I think somebody asked the question, well, does it work in a really big country? Look at Colombia, the way we've worked there. Challenging environment, but it's been very low-key. And yes, the costs have been in the billions of dollars, but not the mega billions of dollars that Afghanistan has been. And Congress has continued to support it because it's been under the radar. And you haven't had, you know, coffins returning on a daily basis back to the United States. And we continue to support that program. So I think we not only need to look at what we can say has worked because we've gotten the data, but look at the methods in terms of how you get it to work. Thanks.
Karen?
Yeah, I'd like to just take it back to what I thought was really interesting, JJ brought up earlier, on the spillover from the states. We get so focused on each state. We do this in imagery as well, customers, we do this in intel, what's happening in a country, what's happening in this narrow area. Could you talk a little bit more about how we see data and imagery working together to go beyond boundaries, to look at the humanitarian issues of what happens in one state, the spillover?
I think in terms of spillovers into other states, I think that is somewhat of a limitation in the failed states index sort of analysis, because you are restricted to, or at least with our methodology and our parameters, we restrict it to UN member states. And so you can, on the one hand, if you look at a country like DR Congo, for example, you can have such internal differences where the eastern part of the country is so significantly different to the western part of the country. But then also, you then have the transnational issues, so the way that Somalia interacts with Kenya. And looking at Kenya's score, Kenya's score is actually influenced by Somalia, because you look at the refugee indicator score for Kenya. I mean, there's really only so much Kenya can really do about that. And so it is a challenge, and I think that's why sometimes this does have to be looked at regionally. I'm not sure if Krista has a better answer on how to actually do that better.
I just wanted to say, I mean, it's been in the past 10 years, I've just really seen a change of all of us, different communities working together. And we have different types of data, we have different types of perspectives, and this change of civil society, governments, even private corporations, and groups like Digital Globe and development organizations, with all of us working together, I think we're going to get better and better at going beyond the Failed States Index, which is just the beginning. I mean, it's just kind of showing this high picture to the point where we understand things much better, much more complex, much more where we're able to look at an area and say, this is what we believe is going on in this area, and bring together our different biases to say, yes, there are facts, but biases and perceptions are also incredibly important. Perceptions can fuel conflict as much as facts can fuel conflict. And so we really have to really understand the story from all different perspectives. Pauline.
Thanks, Krista. On that note, I wonder if the kind of collaboration that's represented at this table could be used for enhanced prediction. Now, we say that the failed state index is not a predictive tool. It's a descriptive and analytical tool. We're not saying country X will fail or so forth, except to the extent that you want to look at the trend lines that you were talking about before. So I wonder if there's a possibility, and I'd like your reactions of people on the panel, of taking categories of issues such as frozen conflicts or contested elections or something like that, to sort of look and identify events or issues that are coming down the line and start creating some sort of index or measurement of which ones are potential hotspots, flashpoints that we should be better prepared for dealing. You know, everything from if you do a frozen conflict from Kashmir to Western Sahara to Kosovo to some of the others, which are really contested areas, which get down to that sub-national level, which often drive the pressures in the other countries to which they are attached or among the countries, including the West Bank. And by the way, a point on that West Bank question that Joshua asked, the other thing that the fund piece does is follow international law. So the international law states that sovereign states and area controlled contested areas are responsible for them. And so we have to include the West Bank, but not Gaza in the Israeli rating. But back to prediction.
This is an extremely exciting area, and there's many different ways to tackle that question. All of those ways, I would say, probably involve some kind of integration of various types of data, and I think that integrating imagery with event data, with economic and development data at the subnational level, certainly would be an optimal approach to trying to unpack that potential. Maybe if we came up with a framework, a list of triggers, and then we were to track various variables using the various methodologies. Yes, absolutely. I think that would be an interesting way to go. But in addition to being very excited, I'm also very cautious about how far one can go in terms of predicting. We at the Fund for Peace, we did some preliminary work in this area using content analysis, trying to identify models of factors that tend to precede outbreaks of conflicts by 6 months, and we came up with some interesting preliminary findings. But one thing that really struck me is that immediately, as soon as you change your time horizon, the things you're looking at within 6 months might be completely different, in terms of trying to predict conflict within a year. Or if you take your sample of countries and you introduce a new sample of countries, it could be a different model. So the models are always changing. So you can land on an excellent model, and then next year it's obsolete for some reason. But that said, I do think that this would be a really interesting avenue of research, and I think there's some ways that we could potentially go in that direction.
But one of the things, just when you said the model is changes, the algorithm changes, one of the things I like to think would happen is we got really good at prediction, we get really good at response, and then we would make what we thought was going to happen not happen, and that means your algorithm will fail. And so we'll have to constantly be doing it, but that would be a happy failure of prediction.
It's a warning. It's a warning kind of response.
Predictive analysis is a real challenge, especially on a countrywide basis or region basis. We struggle with it on the subnational level quite frequently. It comes down a lot to the methodology, and it also comes down to the level of access to the analyst who is overseeing the project. The greater the access, the more ability we have to respond to what the analyst needs. And the other thing that really helps tremendously, at least from the satellite imagery standpoint, is having an archive. We have an archive almost 10, 11 years now. So you can actually go back and look at what has happened previously, and then with an analyst who's looking at all source data, we can actually have a discussion and see how that fits in and how that informs and influences the analysis overall.
The gentleman here had a question in the second row. Sorry, I know I'm missing a lot of hands back there, so if you can wave down somebody if you see them with a mic, that's also a good way to get a question in. Sorry, we're very low down up here.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Herman. I am representing Indonesia Daily, Kompas. Maybe Director Executive Krista. Oh, okay. My name is Herman, and I'm from Kompas Daily, Jakarta. I would like to ask a question which is actually not unnecessary to be raised here, but in Indonesian political context, it is needed to ask once again, especially about the attention or the reason why FPP conducts such a kind of FSI. As a matter of fact, I have interviewed Krista about that, and then my paper said try to avoid conflict between person between people and people, because try to avoid more conflict. So they want more authoritative explanation about that. And one of your second question, and one of your indicators say in Indonesia is a massive corruption in all layers of society, especially when it comes to during the political process. And recently, and even nowadays, the local election in Jakarta is now underway for first round, and it looks that the election is free from vote buying, relatively free from money politics, and does FPP wants Indonesians, local people, to do like that? Thank you.
Okay. So some of you may have seen, but about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the failed states index was hotly debated in Indonesia. Almost every single minister, I think, in Indonesia was asked by a reporter. The minister probably hadn't seen it yet himself. Why is Indonesia being called a failed state by this organization in the United States? And so, as you said, I did do an interview to answer that question because they felt very much like we were creating the index to cause conflict or to call Indonesia a failed state, where I think, as my colleague J.J. Messner explained very well before, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to call attention to the fact that every country has pressures. And you alluded to the corruption in Indonesia. Every country actually has corruption too. But the government, the state institutions have to be strengthened, and they have to be held accountable by their citizens, by their own civil society, to continually improve on the systems that are going to prevent corruption and find it when it happens. Because it will still always happen, but you find it and you punish it, and you can continually try to fix your systems. So the Failed States Index, what we want to do is really create a debate inside a country, as we did in Indonesia, and have the civil society, the government, the corporations working there, everybody come together, debate the numbers. That gets them talking about the issues. What are the human rights issues? Are people being protected? Is there religious freedom? Are there issues of corruption? Have that debate within the societies. Figure out what the priorities are within that society, because you know the context, and then start to make changes to improve them, and use the index as a gauge to kind of look at how you're doing year on year. And so that's the goal of the Failed States Index. And I hope that the debate in Indonesia continues. I'd actually love to see it continue, and I hope that it continues in a way that is very constructive with all elements of government and including in civil society.
Actually, just a quick follow-up. More generally, I think that, and not looking at Indonesia as a specific example, but I think with the Failed States Index, we often see one of 3 reactions from countries to their rankings. The first is to generally ignore them. The second is to reject them because they're. How can you tell us that we are X on the index? Oh, your methodology must be wrong. You must be looking at the wrong things. You must have the wrong guy. Or the third is to actually act upon it positively. And a number of countries have actually done this, and we've seen various countries appoint ministerial level committees to look into why they're actually scoring a particular way, how they can actually improve their rankings. The Fund for Peace will often receive delegations from embassies in DC or be otherwise contacted by governments who will ask us, okay, you've given us these scores, what do you think we can do to improve these scores? What sort of policy areas should we focus on? And this is the third category that we actually encourage. We actually encourage the debate to happen, as Krista was discussing, and also for there to be some positive outcome from that. There are different ways to look at the numbers, and I think that one is by far the better way of doing it.
And finally, although corruption might not be as good of an example in this particular case, but we always emphasize that the Failed States Index looks at both exogenous and endogenous factors. So it's not implicitly a direct indictment of any particular government. It's just the pressures that the state has to manage across the various social, economic, political, and security sectors that it will need to manage in order to promote stability over the long term.
Mike needs a mic.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Michael Lepage, National Defense University. Perversely, my job and career depend on failed states. And I want to say that I think the Failed States Index is an extraordinary tool that I myself have used on many occasions. It is broken down by states, and I understand the logic of that. If you look at things like the Human Development Index, which is broken down into literacy, life expectancy, and per capita GDP, or Freedom House indicators, or a number of other kinds of indicators over the last 30 years, the trends are by and large good. And recently, Steven Pinker has written in his intriguing book called The Better Angels of Our Soul, or something like that, that violence and conflict are in decline. So what is the global trend? I can track your trends country to country, but are we going towards Steven Pinker's trajectory, or as Phil Williams at University of Pittsburgh would argue, are we entering into a new dark ages?
I'm going to attempt to be the optimist. At least in the last couple of years, I couldn't tell you reliably for the entire length of the index, although I think Nate might have looked at it this year himself. But I think that in the Failed States Index book, there is actually a section that has these numbers where I think roughly this year, maybe, well, at least the vast majority of countries improved their scores. The same happened last year. And some countries stay the same. But it really is the relative minority that are worsening. And we are seeing this repeated, at least for a few years now. Nate, I know you did some work on trends.
Well, over the last 5 years, there's been quite a lot of volatility in terms of global trends. If obviously the economic downturn, was a global phenomenon, unlike anything we've seen since World War II. In 2008, there was a massive food crisis that went across the global South, causing food riots and instability across from Africa to Asia to the Caribbean to other places. And then, of course, there was the Arab Spring, which was whether the long term could be positive or negative, but we know that it was a global spike in volatility. So in terms of the global trends, it is interesting that over the last 5 years or so, you've seen ripples that have rolled across the international system. In demographic pressures, in the economic indicators, and in the political indicators, that I'm not sure if this is if we've seen this type of volatility in previous decades. I don't know. My sense is that the level of volatility seems to be higher now than it was before. Now, but in terms of things like good governance or conflict or more specific areas of the indices that you mentioned, maybe those things are improving. But if you take a holistic methodology that looks across social, economic, political, security, development indicators, there does seem to be a degree of convulsion. I don't know if it's going to lead to a dark age, as you put it, but certainly the interdependencies and interconnectedness of the international system is something that is very, very important to watch.
I'm sorry, I see another hand up, but I'm afraid we've gone over time. So apologies. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and such vibrant participation. I also want to give my special thanks to Joe and Spike for joining me here and represent not only our partners in activities as we described, but also sponsors for this event, Digital Globe and Creative Associates, so thank you to them. And I want to thank also our research assistants that are all around and the staff of the FUNCFBs. Thank you guys for all the work you did on the event. And thank you all.